come from. And also it was kind of difficult to pin down, since now you have the gene, and not only the species that you did have in the beginning with Darwin, which is the unit of selection now. Is it the gene, the individual, the family, or the species? These two questions sort of come together, and the selfish gene is a kind of an answer, because it is a unit of natural selection, and it would also be the explanation why there is altruism, why there is some level of cooperation, why there is some kind of reciprocity and kinship selection. So here, this explains why there is cooperation in between individuals that share genes. It does not explain why there should be any cooperation between individuals that don't share too many genes. But one can say that that can be explained culturally, that it's not a biological explanation. But still, this is how far the conceptual framework of neo-Darwinism could get to explain cooperation. And we have this Super Cooperators. There's this book by Martin Novak that has just come out in those lines. But there is a criticism, at least from moral philosophy, about this view, about the selfish gene view. And Mary Midgley, she is already an elderly moral philosopher. She likes to read Darwin in a very, to some people would seem to be a very charitable fashion, because she tries to show that Darwin does not want to explain morality as if it were really something else, meaning that morality comes from the selfishness of a gene that wants to reproduce, that wants to continue, that wants to pass on in another organism. She is very critical about the reductionism in science, but this is part of the scientific method. I'm very sad to say there is no way science really progresses without any recourse to reduction. We do at some point have to choose what we're going to focus on to come up, to build a scientific explanation. But it is true that this sometimes brings a simplification to the conceptual scenario, and sometimes we can cut something that actually should be kept. So it is always good to listen to a philosopher, not that you have to turn into a philosopher, but just to listen to what he has to say. This may be helpful for science. And we found it very interesting that she, in some sense, like us, feels that the spontaneous creativity is really the central concept to life. So it was interesting how we had this coincidence in pinning a concept that we find very fundamental. Now, criticism that comes also from the philosophy of science, per se, not from moral philosophy, and from biology. So this we first heard of from Professor Mauricio Abdala, that is in Brazil, in the Federal University of the State of Espírito Santo, where we don't have yet any research program in metabiology. He wrote this, La Crisis Latente del Darwinismo. Professor Chaitin did talk about this book already. He showed it to you. But anyway, we just wanted to repeat and maybe pin down a little more what Mauricio Abdala points at in his book regarding criticism to the neo-Darwinian paradigm. So he cites the irreducible complexity of cellular mechanisms. How could this be if cellular mechanisms are supposed to be the origin of life, and how come the origin of life could have come up in such a intricate fashion all at once? Lynn Margulis talks about the symbiosis, not a random mutation as an evolutionary driving force. So this is another very particular difference from explaining life if randomness is or is not involved in the process. As a philosopher, I would open a parenthesis here. Do I have time? Yes, I still have time, because I am finishing. The parenthesis is, it has to do with different intellectual traditions in the history of ideas, not only in science. You have these very initial efforts in explaining nature that date from the pre-Socratics, when some of them came up with the idea that the world was actually made up originally by a void and atoms that were scattered randomly, and that would randomly meet due to a certain characteristic that they would possess, and then they would form matter. So from that we have a sort of a very materialistic, mechanistic, involving randomness train of thought or intellectual style in explaining nature. And we also have a completely different tradition that comes with ideas like the élan vital, something that looks more like self-organization nowadays, that does not involve a random principle or a random ingredient in the forming of matter itself, and therefore of life as well. So I see symbiosis instead of random mutations in this other intellectual tradition. And we have, of course, Massimo Sandin, that is trying to, we are trying to get in touch with him. We hopefully will get in touch with him and exchange ideas with him regarding this new proposal, which is a real interesting paradigm shift in how the genes pass and how they are transferred on a horizontal fashion instead of on the traditional Darwinian and neo-Darwinian, what we call vertical direction from generation to generation. And here are the other questions that we have. The origin of life always remains mysterious, still remains mysterious in the neo-Darwinian paradigm. The individual cell being amazingly complicated is also something we already talked about, and the punctuated equilibrium, or the missing intermediate forms, which actually is a point of communication between maybe a different explanation that metabiology would not be entirely alien to. So here we come to our new research directions. We also have been having very interesting conversation with Professor Martin-Delgado, that has already written a paper based on metabiology using quantum information theory, and he has been telling us about all the interesting developments and possibilities on making a quantum model of metabiology, and which is definitely an interesting and we hope fruitful new research direction. There is this new biological paradigm based on horizontal instead of vertical gene transfer, and environmentally driven rather than random mutations, high level rather than point mutations, which eliminates a problem that neo-Darwinism still has. Computer simulations and comparisons with empirical data are something that we do not reject in metabiology, although this was not the way metabiology was first set up. And in a broader sense, social metabiology instead of social Darwinism would be a kind of a projection from biology to the social sciences, where the human being would be not viewed based on the selfish gene concept, but more on the creativity concept. And that's not just the human being, that's the whole life process. So more creativity and less selfishness, maybe. To learn more about metabiology, there is this chapter in Gödel's Way. I think Professor Chaitin has talked about this, but maybe some of you were not here. This has already come out in England. You can get it through through the internet, if I'm not mistaken. You have to go to the site of CRC Press. It's not available on Amazon yet. There is the book Proving Darwin, Making Biology Mathematical. It was sort of, we have already talked about why this title is so, how can I say, is so book selling instead of a more scientific title. This has to do with the fact that we are publishing this through, Professor Chaitin, I'm sorry, is publishing this through Pantheon. That is a commercial editor. And there is this article, Life is Evolving Software, that is also coming out through World Scientific next year. And there is this book, that is probably coming out next year, at the beginning of the following year, Metabiology, Life as Savage Creativity. This term savage creativity comes from a philosopher called Deleuze, and it is, in our understanding so far, the best philosophical counterpart of what Gödel wanted to show, and then Turing in a different way showed, and Professor Chaitin shows in their theories about in order, incompleteness, uncomputability, and incompressibility. And the translation into philosophical language would be savage creativity. The word savage may not be the best in the English translation, but sauvage in French and selvagem in Portuguese does not necessarily mean mad, wild, irrational. It just means something that appeals to a more, let's call, natural, primitive, less technologically driven form of thinking about the world, about ourselves. So it is more creative in the sense that it is out of the box kind of thinking, or out of the box kind of creativity.